All right, I want to talk about TV episodes, and I think it's only fair, since this is the first of these, that I should start with the pilot episode. This is TV Episodes Explained, the pilot episode. So who is a pilot for? And the short answer is the audience, but there's actually somebody that comes in front of the audience, the money people, studio executives, networks, production companies, because pilots traditionally have been a way for TV studios to make a sample and decide whether or not they think they're going to be able to find and build an audience. The second group of people obviously is the audience, because in addition to the teaser and the trailer and, you know, other cast stuff, because we have the internet now, pilots are really the first indication for an audience of what a show's going to be like. It's basically the first episode of every show, although that's not always the case. It's the introduction to the audience, to the world, the characters, you know, what an episode's going to be like, the character dynamics, and it's very important to the studio that's putting it out, or the network or the channel, to see if the audience engages with the material, and it's worth, you know, going forward with more episodes, which could be up until, you know, a couple hundred episodes, depending on how healthy and, you know, long running the show is. So before making the pilot, let's talk about sort of the production funnel that is television. At the top of the funnel, you have sort of the development process. This is scripts, ideas, pitches, maybe some production money, you know, all the sort of the ether, the non-real stuff. Ideas, basically. Going down further into the funnel is purchased scripts, and there's kind of two ways for a script to get bought, either on assignment or on spec. If a script is on assignment, that means the production company or the studio or whatever has the idea, and they're sort of trying to find a writer to come in and pitch them and try to decide whether or not they want this writer to write their show, but it's the studio's idea, or it's somebody else's owned idea. The other one is on spec, and that's basically writers come up with ideas themselves and write shows, and that's a spec pilot, and then they sell it to a studio or a production company or a network, with the hopes being that they stay on board and make a bunch of money and end up being able to make their show, obviously. Either way, the powers that be start working with the writers. There's this back and forth. The writer wants to keep their ness about it, and the studio wants to shape the show as much as possible to be compatible with whatever they think is important for their network or their brand. It's a whole thing, you know, everybody does it differently. And so the next rung down is a pilot is ordered. And so the production company, the studio, the network, whoever is confident enough in the development that they're ready to pay money and basically pay a small movies amount for a crew to go out and shoot a pilot. The reason I call it a movie and not a TV show is a TV show, once it's running, actually has what's called standing sets, which are sets that can be recycled. They already exist. And so there's some cost savings there. They only need to really get built once, as well as a crew and actors are already sort of on the payroll. A pilot, you don't have any of that. You are starting from scratch, very much like movies. And so you have to build sets, you have to cast actors, you have to find crew, you have to find locations. And these are all kind of one-offs because nobody is given the promise outside of the pilot of working on it from there. So if it doesn't work, it kind of just gets thrown away at the end. So next rung down on the funnel, you're in rarefied air now because the pilot has been shot, and so it's completed. And depending on the network and sort of the network schedule of how they deal with pilots, they either just make pilots as they go, or in a lot of traditional network TV situations, there's a pilot season in which, you know, half a dozen or a dozen pilots get shot, and then the network executives all get together and watch them all and pick and choose which ones they think have the best chance of finding an audience, especially against the cost of what they're going to make. And so a pilot is not guaranteed once it's been shot. That's just another moment for people to pick it apart and decide whether or not it's worth spending an incredible amount of money and risk to try to find an audience. And now an even narrower part of that funnel is pilots that get a series order or a season order or at least a half season order. We can name all the shows every year that get this because it's that rare. And so at the very bottom of that funnel is that show that has gone through a whole first season and then gets a second season order. And again, every rung of these is winning the lottery, but very few shows are able to get a second season order just because it really is that hard. There are obviously exceptions to this. If you ever heard straight to series or series order, this is a very flashy thing. This is like winning the lottery twice in the same day. It usually only happens when there's a huge celebrity attachment involved. Netflix and Amazon are actually really famous for this, for doing a series order instead of going to pilot the traditional way, which is to say they put all their eggs in one basket because they really want to work with this fancy person. And as long as this fancy person has an established audience, people like Netflix, places like, you know, Amazon and Hulu have the confidence to go ahead and just order the whole series knowing that the audience is going to show up no matter what. It doesn't happen, but again, it happens every year. It's one of those things. There's also the idea of the backdoor pilot, which is a pilot, but they're trying to be tricky and not have sort of the stink of a pilot on it, because pilots do kind of feel piloty. So they'll have a TV movie, which is a movie made on a TV budget that airs, and based on the success, based on the audience response, if it has enough critical appeal or audience appeal, they'll go ahead and use the TV movie as a backdoor pilot in order to make a series based on that. Jumping off of that, there's the mini-series, which is basically the same thing as a TV movie. It's just multiple episodes, 2 to 4 to 6 or whatever. But based on the audience reception, based on the success of the show, that can be spun as a backdoor pilot into an actual show. A good example from about a decade ago was the Battlestar Galactica reboot. They had a 2-episode mini-series on Sci-Fi Channel, and based on the success of that, we're able to spin that into a multiple season-long spanning show. You can also put a backdoor pilot in a successful existing show. A recent example is the US Office in their final season had The Farm as an episode, which was meant to spin off the Dwight Schrute and a few characters from that side into its own thing. NBC ended up not going forward with it, so it just now exists as a weird episode in the final season of The American Office. And then there's the wildcard backdoor pilot, going viral, some sort of cultural phenomenon. Ted Lasso was an ESPN bit from 10 years ago with Jason Sudeikis. Web series have had a couple successes. High Maintenance on HBO was originally a web series that HBO bought and used as the first season, and then the second season and further seasons were actual produced episodes through HBO. Also, Broad City, again, was a web series about these two girls that Comedy Central bought and redeveloped into half-hour show with multiple seasons. So getting into what a pilot actually is, there's kind of two types of pilots. There's the premise pilot and the third episode pilot, if you've ever heard of that. Premise pilot is really good for starting a complicated world and setting up characters and setting up character arcs and just going. Sort of the weakness of the premise pilot is the premise pilot spent so much time establishing stuff that once you get to episode 2, a regular episode, there's a bit of a backlash, there's a bit of a, what are we doing here? But as long as the show is compelling, you're probably okay, whereas the third episode pilot kind of hedges their bets on the fact that they really want to sell the tone and the character dynamics and what a regular episode is going to be like. The reason it's called a third episode pilot is the pilot is basically any episode that could exist in the series. You establish the norms in the thing without having to explain stuff. And so the premise pilot's really good for really complicated stuff, but there is the risk of episode 2 being too different, whereas a third episode pilot doesn't have to worry so much about establishing stuff. As a comedy person, I actually prefer the third episode pilot because I think character interaction is usually more important, but for really high concept stuff, premise pilots are kind of necessary. And so with pilot episodes, although they tend to look better because studios want to hedge their bets a little bit by pouring a little bit of extra money into the pilot with the hopes that that will get a better audience reaction, the actual overall quality and story experience of the pilot tends to be a little bit weaker than the rest of the episodes, because even young shows, they're still trying to find their feet, not just from the pilot, but even entire first seasons. I point to The American Office or Parks and Rec or even Seinfeld as the first seasons kind of being a mess and then making adjustments going into the second season and actually having a much stronger second season and beyond based on having figured out what works and actually taking out what didn't work. There's also exceptions where there's some absolutely fantastic, undeniable pilots out there. I would point to the Lost pilot or the Breaking Bad pilot, or if you like comedy, the Californication pilot. Pilots can also be recast, reshot, sometimes just thrown out altogether. It's just one of those things. Every so often you hear about a pilot that got rid of an actor or an actress. This happened in the case of 30 Rock, where the pilot that had been shot, the network wasn't super happy with, so they got rid of certain characters and certain actresses and brought in different ones and then reshot it. And so the episode 1 of 30 Rock technically is the pilot, but it's actually the second pilot. Also, Star Trek, the original series, there was a Captain Pike character in the first one who was supposed to be the hero, but because of contract negotiations when it went to series, they picked up William Shatner to be Captain Kirk and just got rid of the Captain Pike character altogether. Even Always Sunny in Philadelphia, their pilot was basically a short film that they had done, and all that material ended up going into episode 4. And so the first episode of the show is literally a third episode pilot in that it's just an average day at the show, which I think makes a show stronger for it, honestly. And so that's pilots. This was a little awkward, a little unfinished. It's not perfect, it's a little janky, but that's what pilots are. So if anything, I feel like I'm on the right track. Next time it'll be a different episode, and it'll be a much more interesting episode because pilots, I feel like, is just the awkward one. Like, share, subscribe. Catch you next time.